How you doing? This is Mike for Working Class Thoughts. So today's episode is actually going to be on Pol Pot and the Khemer Rouge, and we're going to look into how they were established. So Pol Pot was actually born in the village of Prok Sabadat, which was located outside of Kapong Tom. So interesting enough, his name was actually really Salam Sar. Now, Sar was actually, which was a word that actually meant white or pale. So they named him this actually because at birth he had a really light complexion. Now historians actually believe he was born May 25th of 1928. He was actually a mix, though, of Chinese as well as Khmer by ethnicity. Now, although his family did not speak fluent Chinese, they still lived as though they were full Khmer. Now, though his father, Loth, would later change his name to Salat Phem, P-H-E-M. Rather, Loth would, So he actually Pol Pot's father was actually a very profitable farmer, and he owned 9 acres of rice land as well as several cattle. Now, Pol's father's house was actually considered to be one of the largest in the village that he grew up in. And he actually would use the local people during the harvest time to do majority of the manual labor. Now, Pol's mother's name was Sok Nam, which is S-O-K-N-E-M. Now, she was actually a local pious Buddhist. Now, so Pol's 8 siblings, Pol actually had 8 siblings. And he was the 8th of these siblings, which meant he was the youngest. Now, he actually had 2 sisters and 7 brothers. However, 3 of them actually died when Pol Pot was rather young. Now, keep in mind that they were raised in Theravada Buddhists. Now, during festival time, they actually traveled to Campus Thea, or Campus Tom, K-A-M-P-O-U-S-T-H-O-M. Monastery. The next thing is actually really interesting. So Cambodia was actually a monarchy, although the king, he actually held very little political very little political power. Now, Pol's family actually had many connections to the Cambodian royal household. Now, Pol's cousin Meek was actually the consort for King Sazawat Manavong. Now, his cousin would later actually work as a ballet teacher, and once Pol Pot was actually 6 years old, himself as well as his older brother had to travel to Phnom Penh, which is P-H-N-O-M-P-E-N-H, to live with Meek. Now, they were actually considered informal adopted family by their more wealthier family. Now, the practice was actually really custom during that time period that Pol Pot was growing up in. So Pol Pot actually spent 18 months as a novice monk in the city's monastery. While he was there, he actually learned Buddhist teachings as well as how to write in the Khmer language. Now, the summer of 1933, Pol Pot traveled to live with his older brother, Soong, and his wife. Now, his first year there, he began getting an education at a Roman Catholic church, and it was there that Roman Catholic primary school. And Occult Mitch, with Meek paying the bills, of course. So most of his fellow students were actually rich French bureaucrats, as well as Catholic Viennese. He did become fluent in French while he was there. He also became very familiar with Christianity and all its practices. Now, Pol Pot was not very academically gifted. He actually was held back a total of 2 years. He only received the certificate de Atus Primaris Complituris in 1941. He was 16 years old at the time. So Pol Pot naturally went to visit Meek at the king's palace. He had much of his earliest sexual experiences, he said, among the king's concubines. Now, while Pol Pot was in school, the king actually died. French authorities made the choice of putting Nordon Sihanouk as his replacement. And a new junior middle school was actually named College Plom Sihanouk. It was built in Kampong Cham. Now, Pol Pot was selected to live at that school. Now, keep in mind, this level of education, it naturally afforded him to live as part of the Cambodian wealthy society. Now, while going to school there, Pol Pot learned how to play the violin. And get this, he even was an actor in majority of the school plays. Majority of his spare time, though, was spent playing basketball and football. Now, that's actually pretty interesting when you think about it. Now, later, he would actually hire several of his friends from that particular school to work in certain areas of his government. Now, in 1947, Pol Pot actually left that school, and that same year, he managed to pass the exams. It allowed him into the Lais Sawat, which was actually a college. Now, in the summer of 1948, he actually tried for the entry exams, but he actually failed. And due to this, most of his due to this, he actually was not able to attend school with most of his fellow students, and he was not able to continue with that going to that school. At the French National Academy. Sorry about that. I lost track real quick. So he actually ended studying carpentry in 1948 at the École Technique in Russell-Kio. Now, people say that the sudden drop in an academic career actually came as a very big shock to Pol Pot. But you got to really think about it. At the new school he was at was a trade school, so most of his fellow students were actually considered very lower class, and much so than him. So, than the ones that he actually had before that he grew up with and knowing. So, although these fellow students at the trade school were not his peasants directly, it was at the trade school, though, that he met Lang Seri, who would become one of his closest friends and later become the highest-ranking member of his government, the Khemer Rouge. Now, the summer of 1949, he actually secured one of his 5 scholarships, which allowed him to travel to France to study at an engineering school. Now, the next part is very much crucial to understand with Pol Pot. So, during World War II, France was invaded by Nazi Germany, and in 1945, the Japanese ousted the French control over Cambodia. Now, then Sihanouk managed to proclaim independence of its country. So, however, after the war, France reasserted its control over Cambodia in 1946. So, although that allowed Cambodia to create a new constitution and reestablish different political parties within itself. Now, naturally, their Democratic Party won, and their 1946, general election. Now, Sihanouk actually opposed the party's left-leaning reforms. In 1948, he dissolved the National Assembly. Instead, he opted to rule by total decree. Of course he did. Sorry. So anyways, at the same time, the nascent Marxist-Leninist movement had also been established within Cambodia. Now, it was started by operatives of the Ho Chi Minh, and it's an already established party. Now, then the Viet Minh, although it had been destroyed by ethnic tension between the Khmer and the Vietnamese. And that part you're going to have to understand throughout this whole thing. Now, news was actually censored, so historians believe that Pol Pot would have been unaware of this whole thing at the time. So Pol Pot's ability to have an education abroad made him a tiny part of within Cambodia's elite society. Pol Pot and 21 other students set sail for a trip to Saigon en route to Marseille. Now, while there, they stopped in Singapore, Colombo, and around January 1950, Pol Pot took a room at the French private engineering school to study radio electronics. So Pol Pot actually earned really good marks and grades during his first year there. Now, he did, however, fail his first year exam. Now, they allowed him to retest a second time, and he narrowly passed. Now, this allowed him to continue his studies. Pol Pot spent the next 3 years total in Paris. He did leave on several holidays. Summer of 1950, he was one of 18 Cambodian students who joined the French counterparts. They were traveling to Yugoslavia, a Marxist-Leninist state. They were planning on volunteering in the labor battalion building a motorway in Zagreb, Z-A-G-R-E-B. Now, he actually returned to Yugoslavia for a camping trip while he was in Paris. Pol Pot was reported to make little to no effort whatsoever to assimilate into the French culture. He did become very familiar, however, with the French literature, and also while in Paris, Ling, Pol Pot, and 2 others established the Surti Marxists. This was a Marxist organization arranged into a clandestine cell system. They would actually meet to hold self-criticism sessions as well as criticism of other things. So Pol Pot actually helped duplicate the Circle newspaper Risami, which roughly translated to the Spark, named after the former Russian newspaper. So later on, October of 1951, Yuan was elected as head of the Khmer Student Association, or the AEK. They established close links between the organization and the Union Nationale des Étudiants de France. The Circle Marxists actually manipulated the AEK and its later successor organization for the next total of 19 years. A couple of months actually after the Circle Marxist formation, Pol Pot joined the French Communist Party, or the CFP. Pol Pot attended regular party meetings, and which, yes, actually included all of its Cambodian group, read a magazine. The Marxist-Leninist movement was believed to be strong globally. The Communist Party had gained control in China under the Mao Zedong. Added with the French Communist Party, was one of the country's largest political parties at the time. It attracted around roughly 25% of the French electoral process. Pol Pot actually stated many of the Karl Marxist texts was difficult for him to understand. Hold on 1 minute. It's just a lot to get through, so he actually became very familiar with the writings of Joseph Stalin. He actually became very familiar with he studied Stalin's approach to Marxists, stating that it gave him a purpose to life. Pol Pot also studied the anarchist Peter Kropotkin's book, The Great Revolution. Now, that is where they said where he said that he actually got the initial idea to combine peasantry and intellectual. He said that it had to be an equal alliance for it to be necessary to have a proper revolution in a country. So it needed to happen so that the communist system would not fail. In Pol Pot's home country, there was growing strife resulting in King Sonok's dismantling all government, declaring himself total prime minister. Pol Pot wrote an article that he called a monarchy or a democracy that he circulated among the French in Cambodia. Now, at the meeting, the Circle decided that they needed someone in Cambodia to assess this whole situation. Pol Pot naturally volunteered himself. So December, he actually returned to Cambodia without a degree. But Pol Pot arrived in Saigon on January 13th, 1953. And here's an interesting part to this. It just so happened to be that the same day that Sihanouk disbanded the Democratic Party and he started to rule by total decree. Now, at that time, he arrested Democratic Party members of the parliament without a trial. During the same time, Cambodia was at total civil war amid the first Indo-Georgian War. Indocihan. Now, Pol Pot actually spent several months at the headquarters of Prince Norodom, or Chantarainsey. Now, he actually later moved to Phnom Penh, where he would meet Circle member Ping Se. Now, Pol Pot felt that it was the most promising resisting group at the time. Now, was named Khmer Viet Minh. Now, they were actually a guerrilla military group that was a mixture of North Vietnamese-based Viet Minh. Now, they were actually, mainly mixed of Vietnamese and Cambodian fighters. Now, his recommendation was actually agreed upon by the Circle members in Paris, their headquarters. Now, it was August of 1953 when Pol Pot and Roth Samason went to Krabo, Krabo. Now, this happened to be the headquarters of the Viet Minh Eastern Zone. It was over the next following 9 months, around 12 other Circle members actually joined them. Now, Sihanouk, he wanted complete independence from the French colonial rule. Once France actually refused his request, he actually immediately called for public assistance June of 1953. Now, once that happened, the Khmer troops left the French army in large numbers. The French did not want a costly war. They were like, it's just not worth it. So they actually retreated control and left total control to their king. Now, it was November that Sihanouk declared the Cambodians' independence once again. Now, the Civil War actually grew mainly with France backing Prince or King Sihanouk's war against the rebels. Now, once the Geneva Conference called for an end to the First Indonesian War, Sihanouk did secure an agreement from the North Vietnamese, and they actually agreed to withdraw Khmer Viet Minh forces from all of Cambodia's territory. Now, the final troops of Vietnamese actually left October of 1954. Pol Pot actually decided that he wanted to stay in Cambodia. He didn't want to go back to France. So Cambodia's Marxist-Leninists, they wanted to operate secretly, however, so that they can establish a socialist party. Now, this was to serve as a front organization so that they could compete, in the 1955 election. The 1955 September election. And, that September election, it actually had a lot of voter intimidation as well as a lot of electoral fraud. And it ultimately resulted in King Sanok's Songkham winning all of the seats. Sihanouk established a one-party state. Now, this put out hopes that the Cambodian left would actually, take power. Pol Pot rented a place in the Bong King Kang, Boeng, Keng, Kang. Now, although he was not qualified to teach at the school, he actually ended up teaching the school's history and geography, as well as French literature, as well as morals and Chamran Vichia. Now, he married Kham Paneri, which Kheuponnery. Now, they actually had a traditional Buddhist ceremony on July of 1956. At a TASA conference, the leaders actually established the Comp-Yuchian Labor Party. They based their party on democratic centralism. Pol Pot, Tao Samadon, and Noan Chia, now remember those names, actually were part of a four-man team that led that party. So it was, its very existence was to be kept very secret. It remained secret from September to October of 1960. Now that is when Samant became the party secretary and Nguyen Chen his deputy, while Pol Pot took the third senior position, Lang Sari the fourth. Sahak spoke out against the Cambodian Marxist-Leninists, even though he was a supporter of China's Marxist-Leninist government. So January of 1962, Sihanouk's Security Services, started a crackdown, if you will, on all Cambodian socialists. If he found out that you were a socialist, you were done. So he began asserting the leaders of Prachia Chan around July. Samant was arrested, tortured slowly, and then killed. Once Nguyen Chia took a step back from political beliefs. Pol Pot actually became the party leader. Once that happened, Sihanouk's government faced hostility from the left and the right's opposition at the same time. It was all centered on Sihanouk's former Minister of State, Sam Sori, Samsary, who was backed by the United States directly. Thailand, as well as South Vietnamese. Once Sihanouk's father died, however, in 1960, Sihanouk made himself head of state for life. Nobody could dismantle. It was February of 1962 that anti-government protesters actually turned into total chaos and riots, and very destructive at that. So conditions at the Viet Cong camp were very, very basic, and food was very, very scarce. So Sihanouk completely cracked down on the movement. Growing numbers of its members actually went to join Pol Pot at his jungle base. February of 1963, the party's second conference party, Pol Pot was actually elected as the party's secretary. Now, he actually governed from back in the jungle. He never wanted to leave the jungle. The guy was just stuck on being in the jungle. Through all the research, everything I found on him, he was always in the jungle. So, He was early in 1964. Pol Pot established his own encampment that he called Office 100, um, South Vietnamese on the South Vietnamese side of the border. So, interesting enough, this allowed his actions to be officially separate from the Viet Cong. The Central Committee actually met again in January of 1963 to denounce the peaceful transition to socialism, being that espoused by the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, or Khrushchev. Pol Pot started to develop their own form of government, Cambodian version of socialism ideology. The party's main area of growth was royal peasantry, which happened to be one of the largest factions of the Cambodian society. By 1965, their membership was in the realms of 2,000. April of 1965, Pol Pot actually traveled by foot along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to Hanoi to meet with North Vietnamese government figures. He really, with the Vietnam War going on, though, they did not really want to get involved with Pol Pot's forces to destabilize Sanat's government. November 1965, Pol Pot flew from Hanoi to Beijing in secret. His official host was Deng Xiaoping, Xiaping. Although he mainly dealt with Ping Zheng, Zhen. Pol Pot actually gained a very sympathetic hearing among the top governing Communist Party of China. He also received specialized training while he was there, like dictatorship of the electoral class struggles and the political purge. It was in Beijing, though, where Pol Pot actually witnessed the ongoing China Cultural Revolution firsthand, which actually later really influenced his politics on Cambodia, or his policies on Cambodia, sorry. Pol Pot actually left Beijing in February of 1966, and once he arrived, he actually went on a 4-month-long journey along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to reach the new Cambodian Marxist-Leninist new base on Lac Ninh, Nih. It was October of 1966. He and other Cambodian party leaders reached many decisions. Party of Kampuchea, Kampuchea, or the CPK, it was actually kept secret at first, of course. Sanat began to call them Red Cambodians because of their support of Russia ideology. So around January of 1968, a war was launched on the Bay Damaran. It was an actual army post. They targeted police and soldiers. They also seized weaponry. The government's response to the attacks, however, a scorched earth policy was formed. They bombed areas that the rebels were believed to be active in. Eventually, over 100,000 villagers would join the rebels' forces. So around the summer, Pol Pot decided to relocate his base to a more mountainous terrain area that he would call, along the Nagas Trail, Nagas. Now, he called it K5. In the time period that Pol Pot was doing this, he really did establish growing dominance over the whole party from within. He had an absolute control over K5. No outsider was actually allowed to talk with Pol Pot directly without an escort. In November of 1969, Pol Pot traveled to Hanoi to try to convince the North Vietnamese for governing military help. However, they refused. And they said that he needed to revert back to the political struggle system. It was January of 1970 that he actually flew to Beijing in secrecy. It was there that his wife, began to show signs of paranoid schizophrenia. So, in March of 1970, while Pol Pot was in Beijing, members of the Cambodian parliament, actually led by Lon Nol, deposed Sihanouk while he was out of the country. So ironically, Sihanouk himself flew to Beijing at the same time that Pol Pot was there. But while he was there, the Chinese and North Vietnamese Communist Party urged Sihanouk to make an alliance with the Khmer Rouge in effort to overthrow Lon Nol's right-wing government system. Sihanouk actually agreed to this term, which is actually really surprising. So get this. Hold on. Zong Enlis, Enlis, advised Pol Pot, although his role was hidden from Sihanouk. So Sihanouk then formed his very own his very own exile in Beijing. He launched the National United Front of Kampuchea, KAMPUCHEA, in an effort to rally opponents of Lon Nol. So around April of 1970, Pol Pot flew to Hanoi. He went there to urge Lee Duan that although he did need weapons to supply the Khmer Rouge with weapons, he did not want Vietnamese troops. For he stated that Cambodia itself and its Cambodian troops needed to oust Lon Nol themselves. Nobody else. So, as it turns out, the North Vietnamese army decided to collaborate with the Viet Cong to invade Cambodia to attack Lon Nol's forces anyways. Because of that, the South Vietnamese and the USA sent troops to the country to bolster the government and rally support. So, as a result, it resulted in the Cambodian king being involved in the already Second Indonesia War, which was happening all over Vietnam at the time. So the U.S. decided to drop 3 times as many bombs on Cambodia during that conflict as they had used during World War II. The U.S. said that they were targeting the Viet Cong and the Khmer Rouge encampments. However, it was reported that they primarily bombed innocent civilians and innocent civilian villages. This all actually fueled the recruitment numbers in the Khmer Rouge. They had an actual estimated number of 12,000 regular soldiers near the end of 1970. So it was said that it was 4 times that number 2 years later. Around June in 1970, Pol Pot left Vietnam and he managed to reach his K5 base by July. And it was in July that he decided to head south. That is when he began calling himself Pol Pot. Remember, I told you the name thing was significant. So, get this. By September, he was based at a camp near the border of Kratie and Kapong Thom. There, he arranged a meeting with the CPK Standing Committee. It resulted in Cambodia must be self-reliant and fully independent and of any other countries whatsoever. Decision being made. Around November, Pol Pot and Panerai relocated to the K1 base at Dang Kada, Dangkda. Pol Pot actually set up on the northern side of the Chanit River. The entry was actually very much strictly controlled. And around the end of that year, Marxist forces had a massive presence over half of the Cambodian population. Keep in mind that the Khmer Rouge actually played a restricted role in all of that. In 1971 through 1972, majority of the fighting actually against Lon Nol was carried out by the Vietnamese or by Cambodians who were underneath Vietnamese control. So January of 1971, a Central Committee meeting was held at Pol Pot's base. They brought together 27 delegates to discuss the war. The whole year of 1971, Pol Pot and other senior members mainly focused on the construction of the regular Khmer Rouge army. They needed it to take control, to take the central role when the Vietnamese withdrew their troops. So July and August, Pol Pot actually oversaw My Long training course for CPK elders in the Northern Zone headquarters. So early in 1972, Pol Pot embarked on his first tour of Marxist-controlled areas in Cambodia and into the liberated zones that he called corruption, was stomped out, Marxist-controlled areas across Cambodia. So in the liberated zones, corruption was stomped out, gambling was banned, and alcohol and marital affairs were strongly discouraged. 1970 and 1971, the Khmer Rouge had generally cultivated good relations with inhabitants of Cambodia. They also organized local election assemblies. If the people were deemed hostile towards the Khmer Rouge movement, they were executed on the spot. Co-op stores selling goods like medical supplies, clothing, and kerosene were established underneath this new system. This provided goods imported from Vietnam without the Vietnamese being there. Wealthy families had their land actually redrawn up. So by the end of 1972, all families in the Marxist-controlled areas possessed an equal area of land. Now, really, from 1972 on, the Khmer Rouge began to refashion all of Cambodia in the image of a poor peasant, wearing black clothing and red and white krama scarves, as well as sandals that were made from car tires. Yes, you heard that right. Their sandals were made from car tires. So Pol Pot naturally wore the exact same outfit. All the CPK members were expected to attend regular lifestyle meetings. They were encouraged where they would engage in criticism as well as self-criticism. It naturally actually created an atmosphere of violence and suspicion within the Khmer Rouge movement. Only Pol Pot and Nguyen Chia was actually not criticized. By early of 1972, the relations between the Khmer Rouge and the Vietnamese Marxist allies actually became very, very much strained. Ultimately, violent clashes actually began breaking out. That same year, North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong Mon forces began pulling out of Cambodia. As they became very dominant, the Khmer Rouge became more dominant. The CPK imposed an increasing control over Vietnamese troops that were actually still active in Cambodia. They want complete control over them. They're like, "You're my country, I got control over you." It's like that. That's what they were saying. So, March of 1973, Pol Pot actually ordered a colonialism of all areas that he controlled. It was both ideological, as it was seen to be helping to build a socialist society free from private property. See, Pol Pot's system, he did not want anybody to own anything. You didn't have any private property, whatever. Everything that you owned was the state's. Period. Point blank. The TV you watch at night, the state's. They could take it back anytime they want to. The car you drive, the state's. They could take it back anytime that they want to. Your cell phone, anything. Everything is the state's. You own nothing except for the clothes, which they provide to. But anyways, we're not going to get involved in that right now. So it allowed the Khmer Rouge greater control over the food supply. Many villagers actually resented it. And they would actually slaughter their livestock to prevent the Khmer Rouge from to prevent their livestock from becoming Khmer Rouge private or collective property. Over the next 6 months, 60,000 Cambodians fled from areas under Khmer Rouge control. The Khmer Rouge formed a draft to up their numbers. So July of 1973, Pol Pot ordered the internment of any Khmer Rouge that has spent time in North Vietnam. Most of them would be executed on the spot. So the summer of 1973, the Khmer Rouge launched its first attack of the Phon Pini, but had heavy losses. Later that year, it began bombing the city with artillery. By autumn, Pol Pot actually traveled to Krok Sadak, a base on the foothills of the Cambodian mountains. September of 1974, a Central Committee meeting was held, and there, the Khmer Rouge agreed that it would expel the population of Cambodia's elites living in rural villages. They saw it as a necessary measure in dismantling capitalism and urban vices. By 1974, Lon Noy's government lost a great deal of support, both domestically within Cambodia as well as globally. So, 1975, troops defending Phon Phin began discussing surrender. They eventually did, April 17, 1975. It allowed the Khmer Rouge to enter the city for the first time in years. There, the soldiers actually executed 700 to 800 senior government, military, and police figures. Now, other senior members managed to escape. Lon Nol himself actually escaped to the United States of America. He left Sahonk Khoi the active president, however, although he would later flee aboard a U.S. Navy ship shortly after. So, within the city, the Khmer's militia, under control of different zone commanders, clashed with actually each other. It resulted in a turf war. The Khmer Rouge actually had a history of viewing the Phon Phin population with mistrust, mainly due to the large number of its population being seen as traitors. Shortly after, hold on 1 minute. So, shortly after, they had control of the city. The Khmer Rouge announced everyone had to leave to escape an upcoming U.S. bomb raid. They said everyone could return in a total of 3 days. It involved in moving 2.5 million people, as well as between 15,000 and 20,000 people being moved from hospitals, and were forced to march. Sorry about that. If you're still with me, I'm sorry about that. It was developing a little bit of a sinus infection. So let me see where I was at that. All right, everybody, hold on 1 second. So checkpoints were actually created where the Khmer Rouge people search people for, anything and remove any personal belongings. Now, this march actually happened to take place in the hottest month of the year. Many people actually died on this journey. Death toll is actually estimated at around 20,000 people. The Khmer Rouge saw this as demolishing capitalism within Cambodia, but also Sanok's power base, as well as the CIA's network in dismantling it all. It helped secure the Khemer Rouge dominance over the country completely. So on April 20th, 1975, 3 days after the Phnom Penh fell, Pol Pot secretly arrived in the abandoned city. Now, he naturally had leaders of the Khemer Rouge with him. He based himself in a railroad station. In May, they actually relocated there permanently. Now, they actually relocated to the former finance ministry building. Now, their top priority, Pol Pot said, should be agriculture. Pol Pot declared agriculture a national defense. Pol Pot believed unless Cambodia could develop swiftly, they would be vulnerable to Vietnamese domination, as it had in the past. So Pol Pot wanted to reach 70 to 80% farm mechanism and machinism, in 5 to 10 years, as well as a modern industrial base in 15 to 20 years. Pol Pot envisioned developing a way to make farmer work. Pol Pot actually insisted that in developing a way to make the farmers work harder and faster. The Khmer Rouge wanted to make a Cambodian self-sufficient state. They did not reject foreign aid, however. China supplied them with a very much substantial food aid. However, it was not public knowledge. It was not allowed to be public knowledge. Shortly after taking control of Phnom Penh, Ling Suri traveled to Beijing to negotiate 13,300 tons of Chinese weaponry to Cambodia. Now, April's National Congress meeting, the Khmer Rouge actually stated they will not allow any foreign military base on Cambodian soil whatsoever. And this was a direct statement, however, to Vietnam. It still had roughly 20,000 troops in Cambodia. So to ease the tension of arising territory clashes with the Vietnamese soldiers over the Y Island, WAI, is an island. So Pol Pot, Nguyen Chia, Ling Suri traveled secretly to Hanoi, where they offered a friendship treaty between the two countries. After that meeting, Pol Pot proceeded to Beijing in secret. Now, Mao urged the younger Cambodian not to be uncritical and admitted at the path to socialism pursued by China. Also, to avoid repetition of more extreme acts from the Khmer Rouge, like the acts that they had been conducting. China was frowning on that. He was like kind of like slapping him on the wrist, slapping Pol Pot on the wrist, saying, "Hey man, keep on the path to the socialism we've taught you, but you know what I'm saying? By the way, tell your troops to quit doing all that crazy stuff." That's basically what that meant. So while he was in China, Pol Pot received treatment for his malaria and his gastric ailments. Now, after that, Pol Pot traveled to North Korea to meet with Kim Song II. Mid-July, he went back to Cambodia. Now, it was around May that Pol Pot adopted the silver propaganda as his main residence. Now, he would later relocate to the city's tallest structure, the 1960s built bank buildings, now which later was named K1. Now, naturally, several other city government, senior government officials stayed there with Pol Pot. Pol Pot's wife, who had schizophrenia, her condition actually grew relatively worse. She was sent to live in a house in Boong Camp. Sorry, there we had a little technical interruption. So, Pol Pot's wife is actually sent to live in a house in Boong Kang. Now, to give his government a better look of legitimacy, Pol Pot organized a parliamentary election. Although there was only one candidate in every constitutional except Phnom Penh, Phnompenh. Although Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge remained the de facto government, there was a formal government, the Gronk Coalition, although its nominee head, Pen North, remained in Beijing. Now, although through 1975, the Communist Party's government at Cambodia was kept secret, at a special National Congress meeting during April 25th through 27th, the Khmer Rouge agreed to make Shamok the nominee head state. He retained the status throughout 1975. Pol Pot decided this was a good thing. Now, he happened to take advantage of Sanok's loss in the sense that, he had a non-aligned movement. Sanok settled in his palace, and he was, actually treated really well. So he was allowed to travel abroad, meaning Pol Pot allowed him to travel wherever he wanted to go. In fact, he went to the UN General Assembly to promote the new Cambodian government that Pol Pot and him was developing, mainly Pol Pot. Then November, he actually left on an international tour. So during that time, the Khmer Rouge military forces remained divided into different zones so that all of the troops into one national revolutionary army to be headed by Son Sen, S-O-N S-E-N, and you need to remember that name too. So there was a new currency that actually had been printed in China. The Khmer Rouge decided not to introduce it, however. They decided that it would lead to corruption and undermine their efforts to create a socialist society. There was absolute no wages in Cambodia society. The population simply did whatever the Khmer Rouge commanded them to do, and they did it without pay. So if you did not do what they told you to do, it was mandatory punishment or execution on the spot, and normally it was execution on the spot. So in September, Pol Pot actually announced that all farmers are expected to meet a quota of 3 tons of paddy or rice, an increase of whatever there was previous year that was grown. So if you grew this much this previous year, Pol Pot expected you to do double or triple that the next year, or you're going to die. It's just that simple. He also announced all manufacturing jobs should produce basic agricultural machinery and bicycles. So 1975, everyone living in royal co-ops meant most of the Cambodia society to be classified into three groups. Now, these three groups were full right members, candidates, and depositees. So within the villages, Khemer Rouge military regularly killed those deemed to be bad elements of society. Khemer Rouge basically had a statement: to keep you is profit, or to keep you is no profit, to destroy you is absolutely no loss. So they would basically bury the dead in the fields, and they basically used them to be used as fertilizer. So the standing committee decreed that all of the population would work 10 days a week with 1 day off from labor. Cambodians were told to talk about themselves in a plural, we, rather than singular, I. So basically what that meant is you were no longer to refer to yourself as an individual. You were only to refer to yourself as we, meaning we are. There is no more you. That's basically what that meant. So workers in fields were separated by sex. Sports were strictly prohibited. Only reading material was provided by the state was absolutely allowed. Now, restrictions were placed on your movement. You were only allowed to travel with permission from local Khemer Rouge authorities, who basically, they had their checkpoints at the end of certain roads, and you got caught without your papers, you were killed. So January of 1976, a cabinet meeting was held to promulgate a new constitution declaring that it be named the Democratic Kampuches, Kampuches. The constitution said and states that the state owns all means of production. Male and females are to be equal. There is no more male race or sex. There is no more female sex. You are all equal. You are just one worker. That is it. You are an item. That's what Pol Pot decided. So all citizens were forced to work regardless of age. As soon as you were able to walk and they could figure out that you could use you for something, you started working. The government would be ran by three people. Pol Pot and the Khemer Rouge expected Sihanouk. One would take one of these positions, however. However, in March, he resigned from his post. So meaning that the king, he was expected to fill one of the positions, but he didn't like the direction that Cambodia was going in. So in March, he resigned from his post. So the removal of Sihanouk actually ended the Khemer Rouge government, and it can no longer be a united front within a secret united front within the government. So with him gone, Pol Pot stated national revolution is over. So now it's on the full-on socialism revolution. Now, this could allow the country to move towards pure communism. That's what Pol Pot said. So basically what he said is, hey, me and my people, we secretly tried to infiltrate the government system, and we formed our own little democratic party, and we tried to infiltrate it, and it didn't work. So his statement was, the only way to make the country move towards pure socialism is all-out revolution. So in 1970s, Marxist-Leninism was at its strongest point in humanity's history. Pol Pot was seen as an example for revolutionaries to follow. In principle, the Khemer Rouge Standing Committee made decisions on the basis of Leninist principles of democratic socialism. So the parliament, which had been established before, never met after 1776. The Cambodian population were officially known as Kampuchean, Kampuchean, rather than Khemer, which was their ethnic race. They actually took away their race. They said, you no longer have your own race. This is what you are. So to avoid ethnic specificity, they basically did this, they said, to avoid any ethnic association within their society. They wanted to do away with it all, so now they only have one term. The Khemer language was now called Kampuchean by the government, and it was the only language allowed in the country. If they heard you speaking any other language, they killed you. It was that simple. So Pol Pot began trying to build major projects across the country, such as dams. Many projects actually failed due to lack of experts. Members of the Khmer Rouge received special treatment, not enjoyed by the rest of the population. The Khmer Rouge classified people based on religion and ethnic background, including where you were allowed to live at and where you were allowed to do anything at. So Pol Pot had a policy of state of atheism. He banned all religion in the country. In fact, Buddhist monks were viewed as social parasites. With the 1 year of Khmer Rouge, the monks were set to manual labor, meaning if you were a monk, your butt was off to the field to go. You were working. So eventually, several isolated revolts broke out against Pol Pot's government officials. The Western Zone chief, Koa Kong, then began launching small-scale attacks on government targets along the Thai border. Several villages had rebellions form among the Cham, C-H-A-M. February of 1976, various explosions in the Siam Reap destroyed a munitions depot that Pol Pot had. So Pol Pot actually suspected senior military people were behind it, and he had them arrested immediately. So September of 1976, various party members were arrested and accused of conspiring with Vietnam to overthrow the government. So over the next couple of months, arrests actually increased. The party members were accused of being spies for the Central Intelligence Agency of America as well, or it was either that or they said you were a Soviet KGB spy or a North Vietnamese spy, being different ones from different agencies naturally. They couldn't just say everybody was underneath one banner. The Khmer Rouge converted discussed a private school like converting it into a security prison because it was abandoned. This prison was to later be known as S-21, and it was, let me just tell you, is one of the most notorious prisons in world history, as far as if you even want to call it that. So the first half of 1976, 400 people were actually sent there. By the second half, that increased to 1,000. By the spring, 1,000 were brought there every single month. Roughly 15,000 and 20,000 people were killed at S-21. About a dozen were Westerners. Just nobody knew about it at that time. So from 1976 onward, especially in the year 1977, levels of violence increased across the whole country of Cambodia, particularly at the village level, meaning peasantry. So across the country, peasants, cadors, tortured and killed people they disliked. Meaning if they had a neighbor that they disliked, there was so much murder going on underneath Pol Pot's regime that if they just had a disagreement with somebody, they just killed them. They just called them an enemy of the state and killed them. So many would actually eat their victims' livers or other body parts. And then they would also tear unborn fetuses out to basically eat and actually use the skulls and bones as talismans for their rituals. So by 1977, the growing violence actually erupted with poor food, making a disillusion grow within the Khmer Rouge itself. You know, like the core support of the Khmer Rouge, like a disillusion was growing because underneath Pol Pot, there's so much violence, so much death, and so much bad food that it even started affecting the senior members, you know, that have been there for years. Remember earlier when I stated that most of them, you know, that he hired actually went to school with him. So, I mean, these are people he's known his whole life, and even they were like, dude, you're doing too much. They were getting disillusioned by it, you know? But anyways, so autumn of 1977, Pol Pot declared the purges at an end. I should actually state that. So, if you didn't know, when Pol Pot first became power, he said we're going to start a purge, which he called a purge of all Western ideology, a purge of all religion, a purge of anything that was against Khmer Rouge. So, autumn of 1977, he said he's announcing an end of it. But by August of 1977, Between 4,000 and 5,000 party members were completely liquidated and known as enemy agents or bad elements, meaning they were killed. So by 1978, the government announced a second purge to begin, and thousands of Cambodians were accused of being Vietnamese sympathizers or Western sympathizers or Russian sympathizers, and they were swiftly killed, often their whole families. The remaining CPK members who spent time in Hanoi were killed along with their children, meaning political people. So in 1976, made tensions between Cambodia and Vietnam grow. May of 1976, a negotiation for a map with Vietnam failed. China became Cambodia's main source of support at that point, with Vietnam continuing to side with Russia. So, November of 1976, Pol Pot traveled to Beijing secretly seeking to retain his country's alliance with China after the Gang of Four was actually arrested. I might do an episode of the Gang of Four, just throwing it out there. So historians actually estimated that 1.671 million to 1.871 million Cambodians died as a result of the Khmer Rouge policies, or between 21% and 21.4% of Cambodians' 1976 population total. So also, 300,000 Cambodians starved to death between 1979 and 1980. So Pol Pot actually grew suspicious of Son Sen, and in June of 1997, he ordered his death. Khmer Rouge cadres substantially killed the son and 13 of his family members. And asides, Pol Pot later stated, though, when he was caught, "I did not order those murders, and I did not sanction any mass genocide." So Ta Mok was concerned that Pol Pot could turn on him. So he rallied up troops, saying that Pol Pot betrayed their movement, the Khmer Rouge movement. So June 12th of 1997, Pol Pot and his family fled on foot. And he was so frail. They said that he had to be carried. Like, he couldn't even walk. He was so old, and he was so frail and so malnourished that they said that he actually had to be gently carried. So they fled on foot, though. And Pol Pot, like I was just saying, was frail. So Pol Pot was caught and placed on house arrest. July, Pol Pot was actually sentenced to life in prison by the Khmer Rouge itself. And 3 of his closest friends and commanders were sentenced to death. So on April 15th, 1998, Pol Pot actually died in his sleep of heart failure. His body was actually preserved with ice so that his death could actually be verified by journalists, worldwide journalists, that were attending his funeral. He was so bad and killed so many people that his body had to be put on ice just so the world journalists could document that he actually died and that it was him. But anyways, so 3 days later, his wife actually cremated him on a pair of Pirates tires and a pile of trash rubbish. There is suspicion, however, that he committed suicide once he discovered that Tom Mox actually planned to hand him over to United States of America Central Intelligence Agency. So, like I said, this episode is packed with a lot of information. Pol Pot was one of the most sadistic dictators in world history. The man he was one of the world's most brutal dictators. The reason why I have him on what I consider one of my favorite ones is the way that he did it. Although I stand against socialism, I will never embrace socialism or any form of socialism. I think this episode will actually show you results and what happens with that. And the reasons why you should stand against it. That's just me. Neither here nor there. I'm not pushing no political agenda here. But anyways. That's just how I feel. But yeah. But anyways. You can see how it all happened. I mean, they had a monarchy system at the beginning. Although he didn't hold, that much power. And then over a period of time, it changed into socialism. It was democratic socialism is what they were saying at the beginning of the research material. Then that changed, and that morphed into something else, and then that morphed into something else, and then morphed into communism, and morphed into dictatorship. So this is why I stand against that. That's as far as I'm going to go there. But as far back to Pol Pot and the regime, these men are responsible for some of those horrendous crimes, some of the most worst tortures that you'll ever see. The amount of bones that are in this field, it is still being found to this day. They are still finding new bones in this field at Cambodian people to this day. That's how many bones. Like, they showed a lady walking on the dirt path, and she was kicking dirt aside, and you could see the white as a result of someone's bones that were actually in the ground still. That's how many bones they are. They simply cannot get all of the bones. That's how many people were killed. They only have the numbers that they're throwing out there. These are core numbers, meaning that they're verified numbers by whoever organization. But it is common knowledge that there is no official number of victims that died underneath Cambodia's Pol Pot whenever Pol Pot had control of it. And he led some of the most brutal things, some of the most common practices that he had was just horrendous. For instance, child marriage was common underneath Pol Pot's regime. In fact, forced marriages were common underneath Pol Pot regime. If a Khemer Rouge member stated that he wanted to marry somebody, and that woman's family spoke up against it, they would be killed. Or if the girl spoke up against it, they would be killed. So you just didn't have no choice. And like I said, whenever Pol Pot established his full form, as short-lived as it was, I want to throw that out there, as short-lived as it was, when he had the full dictatorship. I'm not talking throughout his whole career. When he had full control, an active dictator, in that short amount of time, he killed a countless number of people. And his methods were out there. They would do stuff like take a spike and take it through, like right in here, and just shove it through your back, along your spine, and basically come out the top of your butt, top of your ass, just sticking out. And then they would have two people carrying you off to the field. Child soldiers were common. This was, like I said before, they would basically, as soon as you gave birth to a child, as soon as a Khemer Rouge official stated that that child can actually do something, that child was taken from the mother's custody and forced to work. There was no choice. You had no choice. And then the other bizarre part is, to me, the other bizarre part is the manipulation behind it that he did. When you take away somebody's identity to the point to where they're no longer to call themselves male or female as an official state policy, that's a state policy underneath his watch, Pol Pot's watch. That over a period of time will mess with somebody's head. I'm not talking to people that were like they knew it before. I'm talking about people that didn't know anything else, and that's the only thing they know. Because I'm telling you, people underneath Pol Pot's regime, I can't think of too many people that would revolt against them. There were revolts, but I'm talking the majority of people, though. I mean, you just did whatever they said because you'd be killed otherwise. Then the child soldiers, some of them were so small that to see them holding these guns are taller than some of the children that's holding the guns. And I'm talking at shooting stance when they were shooting them. It just looked like they were holding this giant tree trunk because they were so small holding a gun. So, I mean, this is how brutal Pol Pot's regime is. This is how brutal socialism can get. Now, keep in mind, it started underneath the monarchy, turned into one thing, and morphed into, basically it took all the steps. Pol Pot took all those steps to get to total dictatorship. But anyways, either here nor there. This has been Mike for Working Class Thoughts. This has been Pol Pot and the Khemer Rouge. I hope you guys learned about the Cambodian people. Something else I want to throw out there. There is a lot of things that charities out there that you can donate to help the people of Cambodia. I know a lot of people Cambodia, they're still dealing with stuff to this day. I think it's getting better, but they're still dealing with stuff to this day. So I'll just throw that out there. And again, this has been Mike for Working Class Thoughts. It's been Pol Pot and the Khemer Rouge. A little bit about the history of Cambodia during Pol Pot's time. I hope you guys learn what you will from this, and I know everybody draws their own conclusions at the end of the day. Hey, guys, expect a new episode coming your way very soon. I'm trying to decide between which one it is, but it looked like it could be dwelling into the world of organized crime. So, this has been Mike for Working Class Thoughts. Peace, love, and good vibes. Everybody have a great night.
Some 2,000 people were unaccounted for.
Do you remember me?
Nobody knows how many of them were executed on the spot.
Do you remember me?
Or how many were sent to concentration camps where the murder continued.
Do you remember me?
The rest were expelled. 49,000 Muslims lived in Swanik.
Do you remember me?
None remain. This is ethnic cleansing.
Dear motherland, sorry I ain't been around the last time we seen each other. Our country was a battleground. I wound up overseas, a refugee in a foreign land. Thank you to the Republic of Ireland for helping out my fam. It's good to be back in the place where it all started, and to walk around my city without feeling like a target. They say home is where the heart is. I say it wholeheartedly, though we living apart, it'll forever be a part of me. Let me take you on a journey to the city where I grew up. Sportnik, Bosnia, southeastern Europe. Look it up in Wikipedia to see from where I came. The background of my town would take forever to explain. I'm from a mountainous range, a valley on the river Drina, Podrinja. Back in the day, no other place was more serene. Before the war, before the cleansing, and before we had to leave. It's the place where I was born and forever lives in me. CV, dear motherland, do you remember me? CV, do you remember me? Dear motherland, do you remember me? CV, do you remember me? Dear motherland, do you remember me? CV, do you remember me? Dear motherland, do you remember me? CV, do you remember me?
In a village 2 miles south of Swanik, 2,000 Muslims are stranded and struggling to get out.
I remember when I was young, walking around these roads and wondering what's up with all these people dressed in army clothes, and why my mother looking scared and my father looking angry. What's up with all the tanks and the weaponry they carry? That's when it all changed. Friends and neighbors became foes. Paramilitary units started arriving in droves and bombing our homes. I was watching it all happen, only 7 years old, too young to understand it. But I remember the fear and the feeling someone's out to get you with their guns out, and ain't nobody around there to help you. If you ain't been in warfare, it's hard for me to convey it. Imagine dodging bullets while bodies are scattered on the pavement across the Drina basin. Basically bore the brunt of it, ushered into the killing fields with their guns thundering. Lucky that we escaped it, but so many never made it. Rest in peace to all the souls that should have never been taken. Dear motherland, do you remember me? CV, do you remember me? Dear motherland, do you remember me? CV, do you remember me? Dear motherland, do you remember me? CV, do you remember me? Dear motherland, do you remember me? CV, do you remember me?
Numbers are difficult to estimate. It's possible that as many as 20,000 people are on the move along this trail of tears.
Book locally ឆ្នាំ1979 ពពោវិចិត្រចេញបដិញបាញ់ខ្ញុំមិនពួនស្រឡាញ់ជាតិខ្ញុំមិនចេះខ្លាចកើតមកគៀមវាស្រែកទៅប្រាជ្ញនៃខ្លះវាចាប់បានវាឲ្យធ្វើវាស្រែកនៅដីដប់នៃខ្លះវាមានចូលចិត្តវាយកបាញ់ចោលឲ្យបាញ់តឡងងាប់អស់ពីលេនរាប់លេនទៀតស្ដាប់ខ្ញុំមកអត់មានខុសមានត្រូវធ្វើទៅខ្ញុំមិនខ្វាត់ប៉ុន្តែឥឡូវក៏វេក៏ឆ្ងាយទៅវេកំសត់អត់ណាចនឹងទ្រព្យសម្បត្តិស្រីនឹងមាសប្រាក់មិននៃល្វីទៅបងកូនប្រពន្ធប្តីប្រវេះបាក់ The ending is just the beginning life after death the route to new era the resurrect The ending is just the beginning life after death the route to new era the resurrect ឆ្នាំ1983ខ្ញុំចន់ដីអាមេរិកខ្ញុំឃើញភងអាសចិន Mexican និងអាកាព្រិចវាមកចាប់ដៃខ្ញុំឲ្យថា Welcome to America ខ្ញុំជម្រាបសួរវិញថាខ្ញុំមកពីស្រុកកម្ពុជា Oh yeah I know វាឆ្លើយមកថាវិញ I love Cambodia បាត់ដំបងឯភ្នំពេញខ្ញុំមើលទៅ Mother ទឹកភ្នែកពេញ And then my father យកគណៈជូតចេញ Don't worry my friend we'll take care of you មកប្រែមកវិញថាខ្ញុំទៅនេសួរខ្ញុំចូលទៅតុងជាតិវេថា America number 1 វាថា No not when you lose your freedom យកនឹងខ្ញុំគេយំមិនថ្វាយបង្គំលោកយាយលោកតា Cause I know man from that point on it can only get better beginning. Life after death. The route to new era.
The resurrect.
The ending is just the beginning.
Life after death.
The route to new era.
The resurrect.
The ending is just the beginning.
Life after death.
The route to new era.
The resurrect.
I love my land to death. A child of the killing field. North Star resurrect. Generation X. What's next? It's time for us to heal. Been suffering for decades and decades of genocide. A lie to date a generation. A little demonstration of crime. Now why do we do what we do? Like Hitler's to the Jews and whites to the black. They act like we slaves. I'd rather be back where I was born than here confusing days. I love America, but anyways, time passed fast, but yet I ask questions from teachers, books, and crook. I'm trying to get the hook up, observing life's lessons, seeing everything from different perspective and different angle. So I strangle the killer. I'm realer than the wise. The millennium is coming, so open up your eyes. The millennium is coming, so open up your eyes.
Life after death.
The route to new era.
The resurrect.
The ending is just the beginning.
Life after death.
The route to new era.
The resurrect.
The ending is just the beginning.
Life after death.
The route to new era.
The resurrect.
The ending is just the beginning.
Life after death.
The route to new era.
The resurrect.
The ending is just the beginning.
Life after death.
The route to new era.
You got blood on your hands, you got blood on your shoes. With a pistol in hand, you just cock back and shoot. You don't know what you're doing, you just doing what you're told. As the time goes by and the truth unfold. You got blood on your hands, you got blood on your shoes. With a pistol in hand, you just cock back and shoot. You don't know what you're doing, you just doing what you're told. As the time goes by and the truth unfold.
You got 2 hands, 2 feet, your ligaments between your body, torso, house to heart, which pump the blood that you bleed. A heart without a soul, a brain that's not been molded. A mind that's being exposed to more than most at 5 years old. The product of your environment, the lesson from a tyrant. Not knowing your surrounding, your culture is dying. You smile and patrol, just doing what you're told. Not aware of your future and what it has in store.
You got blood on your hands, you got blood on your shoes. With a pistol in hand, you just cock back and shoot. You don't know what you're doing, you just doing what you're told. As the time goes by and the truth unfold. You got blood on your hands, you got blood on your shoes. With a pistol in hand, you just cock back and shoot. You don't know what you're doing, you just doing what you're told. As the time goes by and the truth unfold.
I try my best to imagine, to put myself in their shoes. Could I have done what they did without believing in that view? If I was told to pick a pistol and execute my kind, could I dealt with the task at hand, or would I lose my mind? It's a date with the devil, and we ain't even met. Would I go through life with no remorse, or would I have regrets? I seen the future of my family, the tragedy that they see. It's sad to say, it's a part of me, my family, history.
You got blood on your hands, you got blood on your shoes. With a pistol in hand, you just cock back and shoot. You don't know what you're doing, you just doing what you're told. As the time goes by and the truth unfold. You got blood on your hands, you got blood on your shoes. With a pistol in hand, you just cock back and shoot. You don't know what you're doing, you just doing what you're told. As the time goes by and the truth unfold.
I know we've gone through a whole lot of trial and tribulation as our people try to move on from the tragedy that we faced. But my brothers who still killing each other like they did in the past, please stop. We must move on from this. I know it's a hard thing for us to trust our neighbors, cause for what happened to us in the past, but we gotta move on. Look at it as a blessing in disguise for us to spread a culture worldwide.
You got blood on your hands, you got blood on your shoes. With a pistol in hand, you just cock back and shoot. You don't know what you're doing, you just doing what you're told. As the time goes by and the truth unfold. You got blood on your hands, you got blood on your shoes. With a pistol in hand, you just cock back and shoot. You don't know what you're doing, you just doing what you're
mechanic put his Kevlar on wrong, I guarantee you'll meet up with the suicide bomb. Hell broke loose. Hell broke loose. Big fucking ditches in the middle of the road. You pay $100 just for filling in the hole. Listen to the general every goddamn word. How many ways can you polish up a turd? And left, right, left, left, right, left, right. Hell broke loose. Hell broke loose. Hell broke loose. How is it that the only ones responsible for making this mess got the sorry asses able to a goddamn desk? And hell broke loose. Hell broke loose. Left, right, left. What did you do before the war? I was a chef. I was a chef. And what was your name? It was Jeff. Jeff. I lost my buddy and I wept, wept. I come down from the meth, so I slept, slept. I had to go to home, but I left, left. Pants did the wind for a joke. I pranced right in with the dope. Glanced at her shin, she said nope. Hope. Left, right, left. Nimrod, Bodfish, have you any wool? Get me another body bag, the body bag's full. And my face was scorched, scorched. I miss my home, I miss my porch, porch. Left, right, left. Can I go home in March? March. My stance was a chin full of soap. That rancid dinner with the Pope. And left, right, left. Kelly Priscilla got his thumbs blown off. Sergio's developing a real bad cough. Sergio's developing a real bad cough. And hell broke loose. Hell broke loose. Hell broke loose. Boom went his heavyweight and boom went Bowery. Oh, what the hell was it that the president said? Give them all a beautiful parade instead. And left, right, left. While I was over here, I never got to vote. I left my arm in my coat. My mom, she died and never wrote. We sat by the fire and ate a coat. Just before he died, he had a toke. Now I'm home, and I'm blind, and I'm broke. What is next? I'd sell your heart to the trunk man, baby, for a buck. For a buck. If you're looking for someone to put you out of that ditch, you're out of luck. You're out of luck. Ship is sinking. The ship is sinking. The ship is sinking. There's a leak in the boiler room. The poor, the lame, the blind. Who were the ones that we kept in charge? Killers, thieves, and warriors. God's away, God's away, God's away on business, business. God's away, God's away, God's away on business, business. Digging up the tape with the shovel and the pick. It's a job, it's a job. Bloody mood rising with the plague and the fun. Doing the mob, doing the mob. It's all over. It's all over. It's all over. And there's a leak in the boiler room. The poor, the lame, the blind. Who were the ones that we kept in was such a big temptation to be good. To be good. There's always free cheddar in a mousetrap, baby. It's a deal. It's a deal. Got your way. Got your way. Got your way on business. Business. Got your way. Got your way. Got your way on business. Business. I narrow my eyes at the coin slot, baby. Let her ring. Let her ring. Got your way. Got your way. Got your way on business.
Much like a Bodhi tree, the type of tree that Buddha sat under when he attained enlightenment. But no miracles happened here, though it is called the magic tree. The magic was sound. Loudspeakers hung in branches broadcast a revolutionary song throughout Cheung Ak. At night, it is said, they gave outsiders the impressions of a Khemer Rouge meeting. In fact, the music was to drown out the screams of people being murdered. It's hard to imagine what the prisoners waiting in detention must have thought when they first heard the songs. This may well have been one of them. The music blended with the noise of a diesel generator to create a true nightmare of sound. These were the last sounds the victims ever heard. Of all the graves here at Cheung Ak, this may well be the most difficult to think about. The victims who died here were women and children, more than 100 of them. Most of the women who were pushed into this pit had been stripped of their clothes. It is said that some of the buried women had been raped as well. But there was worse to come. Babies died here too. Many were killed before their mothers' eyes. Do you see that big tree nearby? It is called the killing tree. Soldiers grabbed babies by their legs, smashed their heads against it, then tossed them into the pit. All this at night, in the glare of fluorescent lights. And as I'll explain soon, with the sound of revolutionary music too. Why kill children? Why this brutal way? First, it was quick and easy. Also, when one member of a family was murdered, all the rest were often killed too, so no one would be left alive to seek revenge. Another Khemer Rouge slogan: to dig up the grass, one must remove even the roots. Every 2 or 3 months, the staff of the center gather rags, bones, and teeth that have come up to the surface. The clothes inside this box have been collected since 1980. Though most are just rags, if you look at them closely, you will see some that belonged to children. They are here to help us think about the people who came to this place and never left. You may also see strips of cloth used for blindfolds or cords for making hammocks that were used to bind hands. All has been preserved. In 1979, when Pol Pot was finally overthrown, he fled with what was left of the Khemer Rouge to the Thai border. For 10 more years, the last decade of the Cold War, the West continued to fear communism, and our country remained isolated from much of the world. Because Vietnam had established our new government, many countries refused to recognize us. Meanwhile, the Khmer Rouge regrouped in the jungle. Incredibly, they, the Khmer Rouge, were still recognized as our legitimate leaders by most first world countries: the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, France, and Germany. And by their Chinese allies too. Yes, the Khmer Rouge were given a seat in the UN, sent representatives to New York City. They even received financial aid while we struggled to put our country back together. It's hard to believe, but that's what happened. And Pol Pot? He continued as leader of the Khmer Rouge for almost 20 more years. In 1997, when the group split into factions, he was finally put under house arrest. He died less than a year later, maybe poisoned by those who had once obeyed his every whim. But his life had been good. He had married a second wife and enjoyed his grandchildren. It is said that he listened to Voice of America every day on the radio. When he died, he was 73 years old. Some of his victims didn't even reach the age of 2.
Chân sụp oi sự có việc lâu bênខ្ញុំខំមកវិញខ្ញុំតាំងខ្លួនខ្ញុំហើយខ្ញុំបានសុខភាពរបស់ខ្ញុំសប្តាហ៍នេះមានថ្នាំលេបទេទួយបើសិនជាគាត់លុំខ្ញុំយកពីក្រោមមកជូនផងដែរខ្ញុំនិយាយអស់ហើយខ្ញុំនិយាយទៀតទេខ្ញុំមកជួបនឹងគាត់ថាគួរសមហើយលោកមកចង់ជួបគួរទៅទុកខ្ញុំមកជួបលោកតែប៉ុណ្ណឹងធៀបនយោបាយអីទេវាចប់ហើយលោកសុខភាពល្អមានពេលសម្ភារបានយូរហើយពិសេសពី90ប្រាក់ខ្ញុំធ្វើការងារច្រើន95ធ្វើការងារច្រើនបាទហើយខូចភ្នែកគឺខូចភ្នែកគាត់ភ្នែកគាត់ខូចភ្នែកមកខាងគាត់ទៅគាត់វាពើតទៅឈឺពើតdata វាអមជម្រាបលាសុខសប្បាយ
As ruler of Cambodia, Pol Pot was responsible for killing nearly 2 million people. That's a quarter of the country's population. In his 4-year reign, Pol Pot tortured and starved the Cambodians to death. Men, women, children and babies. He turned Cambodia into a killing field.
When I first spoke with Pol Pot, he refused to take responsibility for an absolutely cataclysmic, catastrophic destruction of innocent people.
No one had a clue at how many people had been slaughtered and how many people had died. No one.
On the 17th of April 1975, a guerrilla army known as the Khemer Rouge entered the Cambodian capital Phnom Penh, victors of a 5-year war against a government backed by the Americans. The Khemer Rouge leader was a man most Cambodians had never heard of.
When it was announced that Pol Pot, a rubber plantation worker, was the new prime minister, no one had ever heard that name. It wasn't until late 1978 when his picture began to appear in communal dining halls that his own brothers and sisters realized that it was their brother who was in charge of this government.
Pol Pot was born in 1925 on a rice farm north of Phnom Penh in a Cambodia ruled by the French. At the age of 6, he was sent to the capital to train as a Buddhist monk, but the boy from the village only felt like an outsider in the bustling, modern city.
He didn't have a sense of the multicultural nature of the Cambodian cities like Phnom Penh, which were mostly ethnic Chinese and Vietnamese. Or if he did have that sense, he resented it. When he visited Saigon, he said he felt like a dark monkey from the mountains.
Cambodia's political culture is steeped in resentment towards its neighbors and its racial neighbors. It's steeped in a deep feeling of being a lesser culture. Pol Pot in many ways was a reflection of all of these things.
In 1949, Pol Pot went to Paris as a student. There, his innate racism would find expression in extreme communism.
The years that Pol Pot was in Paris was probably the most hardline Stalinist party in Western Europe, a very rigid doctrinaire party.
The terrible things that happened under the Khmer Rouge between 1975 and 1979 did indeed have a lot to do with ideology, but more to do with racism, with chauvinism, with nationalism. Those were the driving forces and the driving ideologies behind what many call genocide.
Pol Pot returned to a newly independent Cambodia in 1953 and joined the underground Communist Party. Outlawed by King Sihanouk's government, Pol Pot and his comrades fled to the countryside to wage a vicious guerrilla war. Even then, Pol Pot had his sights on ultimate power.
Pol Pot was more likely than not responsible for the execution of his predecessor as leader of the Communist Party in 1962.
He was a man who was able to hold on to power while eliminating any and all opposition.
Pol Pot's ruthless march to power was boosted in 1970 when the Vietnam War spilled over into Cambodia. Pursuing communist North Vietnamese troops across the border, the United States bombed huge areas of Cambodia, killing thousands of peasants in the process. This only increased support for Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge.
There was this terrible mixture of historical events and terrible Cambodian political realities, which ended up with an orgy of mass murder, of which Pol Pot, without any question, was the architect.
By April 1975, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge were in the capital, Phnom Penh.
When they achieved victory in April 75, they felt they were in a position to put in place and to carry out an extreme, pure, total revolution of a sort that was more extreme, more total, purer than any other revolution in history.
When Pol Pot and his army arrived in Phnom Penh, they immediately evacuated the entire population into the countryside. In what would be known as Year Zero, Pol Pot began to destroy and rip up Cambodian society, reducing it to a state of primitive barbarity.
It was very frantic, it was very chaotic, very scary. They just screamed and screamed into the bullhorn that said we had to leave. 2 million Cambodians living in Phnom Penh were evacuated in 72 hours.
It's the take the basket and dump it upside down theory. You broke up every organization that anybody ever had. They were cut from their family, they were cut from their friends, they were cut from their professions, everything.
Believing the city people to be contaminated by their past lives, Pol Pot would rewrite their histories. Money was banned, the Buddhist religion outlawed, and the country's name changed to Kampuchea. Then he dispersed the city people to peasant villages throughout Cambodia, where they would grow rice and build dams for the revolution. Here, in this idealized peasant state, he would purify them through hard labor and brutality.
They did regard the city population as enemies, but mixed with that was a strong ethnic belief that the peasants were the real Cambodians.
We were from day one, because of our skin color, were targeted. Lighter skin meant that you probably came from a more corrupt class. Darker skins were good because it meant you worked in the field. It meant you worked to grow rice to support the revolution.
Little more than nameless, faceless slaves, the city people would literally be worked to death.
You work 12 to 16 to 18 hours, working in the field, growing rice, harvesting rice, building dams.
There's a lot of people do a lot of harsh work. I mean, people work. They work you until you drop dead.
The Khmer Rouge slogan that time was to keep you was no gain and to destroy you was no loss. So we knew that human life was cheap and that if we did not produce, we would be killed.
Fear and the threat of arbitrary, casual death was everywhere.
At one point, I remember just working, and then they just walk up and just shoot the person in the head. You know, the guy just walk up and go boom.
In fact, most of Pol Pot's victims were killed not by bullets, but beaten to death with blunt instruments.
We still didn't know who Pol Pot was. We didn't know what kind of a man he was. We didn't know what he looked like. And I remember just hearing all these accolades and praise about this mighty person, this strong person, this person who loved us, this person who wanted to bring our country back to its glory days.
In Pol Pot's peasant utopia, starvation claimed most lives. The huge influx of city people into the rural areas meant there was not enough rice to feed them. Even the peasants themselves began to starve.
And indeed, rice was withdrawn and exported by the party centre while these people were dying in massive numbers of starvation.
Life wasn't even cheap to Pol Pot. It had no value at all. Even today, the exact number of mass graves into which the victims' bodies were thrown is not known.
You know, Pol Pot was a remarkable man. He was generous, he was kind, he was loving, almost grandfatherly. He had all of the characteristics of a great leader. There are a lot of Cambodians who don't believe that what happened under Pol Pot in fact was his doing, because he was too good a man. Pol Pot believes that what he did for the good of his country.
Few Westerners ever got to meet Pol Pot whilst he was in power. One who did was American journalist Elizabeth Becker, who interviewed him in 1978.
What struck me first was that he was much more handsome and a charming smile. There was some charm to the man. And we were told to sit down, put the cameras away, and we were to sit there and listen to Pol Pot. And when the time was up, the time was up, and he said goodbye.
With her was another journalist, Dick Dudman, and British academic Malcolm Caldwell. To Caldwell, he was more indulgent.
He told Malcolm Caldwell how wonderful the communist experiment was in Cambodia. Two totally different interviews. One was a lecture and the other was an interview.
Later that night, back at their hotel, an unremarkable meeting with Pol Pot was about to turn into an unforgettable nightmare.
A few hours later, I woke up because I could smell cordite, the smell of a gun being fired. And then I heard shots on the second floor. Lots of shots. I didn't count them, but lots and lots of shots. And so I went upstairs, and Malcolm's body was on the floor, and white with death. The gunman walked in and murdered Malcolm. Why Malcolm? The friend, the one friend of the regime, and not us. Some documents suggest that it would have been me. Another one suggested that it was Caldwell. Why? It doesn't make any sense, but nothing makes sense there. Needless to say, after all that, I couldn't imagine how Cambodians lived through almost 4 years of that. I mean, what I went through in 2 weeks, they lived through 4 years and saw their whole lives, their whole country, everything destroyed.
Within 2 years of Pol Pot coming to power, hundreds of thousands of Cambodians lay rotting in mass graves. Starvation, overwork, and summary execution had all taken its toll on the city people and the peasants.
To prove yourself worthy to be kept alive, you have to be productive in the field. You have to be a productive person. They were monsters. But we didn't see them. I didn't see them as human beings.
He never accepted that he was responsible for any of the suffering. He never accepted that any of the people who died were executed for anything but the right reason. And for him to admit the slightest remorse or the slightest responsibility would be intolerable.
Compelled by the racism that was so much a part of his agenda, Pol Pot turned his attention to Cambodia's ethnic minorities.
The Chinese were probably the largest ethnic minority in Cambodia, and half of those perished in the Pol Pot period.
The ethnic Chams, the ethnic Muslims, were the ones who were particularly targeted and just slaughtered.
Pol Pot's most extreme persecution was reserved for the Vietnamese who lived in Cambodia.
There were reports in the Khmer Rouge period of Cambodian men married to Vietnamese being instructed to kill their Vietnamese wives. Husbands who had been married to Vietnamese were also killed. People who could speak Vietnamese were also killed. People who looked Vietnamese were also killed. There are no confirmed reports of any ethnic Vietnamese surviving the entire Pol Pot period.
Yet while Pol Pot's control over Cambodia grew, so did his paranoia. Midway through his reign of terror, he began to see enemies everywhere, even amongst his own supporters.
There was a huge bloodletting in 1977. Purge teams travelling around to other zones, purging the leaderships, killing them, killing their family members, reaching down into the peasantry for their relatives who were suspect and killing them as well.
When he took over in 1975, there were 22 members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. By the end of his reign in power, 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days later, 18 of those 22 members of the Central Committee had been executed.
Most of the executions took place at an old school called Tul Sleng. Known as S-21, it was established by Pol Pot to torture and kill his political enemies. In less than 4 years, Pol Pot sent between 14 and 20,000 people to S-21. Men, women and children were tagged, photographed, and almost all were tortured into confessing.
The whole ideology of the place was that because they were arrested, they were guilty. They must be, because the party was never wrong. It never makes mistakes. The word for prisoner in Cambodia means guilty person rather than someone who's being held. And even if some of the people you kill turn out not to have been guilty of the crimes you've charged them with, so what? You might find that out later. But at the time, it's probably better to get rid of them than to keep them around in case they are guilty.
Pol Pot said that he had never heard of Tuol Sleng S-21, the torture chamber of which almost 20,000 people he ordered went through to their deaths after extensive torture.
Although the Khmer Rouge tried to destroy the evidence, every torture process and every confession of every prisoner was recorded in detail.
The documentation was very important to these people, but I think they were intended partly to convince Pol Pot and his colleagues who saw the documents themselves, saw copies of them, that they were on the right track. They knew there'd be no punishment for killing all these people. There'd be punishment for people who were tortured to death, and this did happen in many cases. The interrogators themselves were often pulled in and interrogated because they were betraying the revolution by going too far, by torturing people to death before the confession was complete, before the party had been proved right.
Of the thousands who entered S-21, just 7 survived, and only 1 was ever released. The rest were either tortured to death or killed and then buried at S-21's customized killing field, Cheung Ek.
This was a systematic regime doing some systematic, cruel things to its own people for reasons that were demented but made sense to them.
Appearing to be at the height of his power, Pol Pot's government was in fact imploding. His psychotic and lifelong hatred for the Vietnamese would be his undoing.
Pol Pot really believed that Cambodia would disappear off the map unless he was able to dispense with the Vietnamese threat. They thought it required a genocidal way of thinking against Vietnamese generally. Also, there's this much more primordial racist feeling that Vietnamese by nature could not exist and coexist with Cambodians, that there had to be an Armageddon. Every Cambodian should kill 30 Vietnamese. They could lose 2 million Cambodians. The Vietnamese would lose 60 million in this Armageddon, and we would still have 6 million left.
In response to continuous raids into Vietnamese territory, on the 21st of December 1977, 150,000 Vietnamese troops stormed across the Cambodian border. By January the 6th, 1978, they were on the outskirts of Phnom Penh.
With Cambodia, you have a span of 4 years of daily persecutions, humiliations, starvations, pain. So your soul as a human being gets desecrated more and more and more. So by the end of the 4 year, your hate, your anger, your hunger makes you a little bit less of a human being.
Pol Pot and thousands of his Khmer Rouge henchmen fled Phnom Penh to northern Cambodia and Thailand. From here, Pol Pot continued a guerrilla war against the new Vietnamese government. It would be another 20 years before he was seen again, but this time he was on trial.
The Khmer Rouge were people who no longer had faith in Pol Pot's leadership. They had arrested him, but they had arrested him not for crimes of genocide or crimes against humanity. They'd arrested him for essentially being a political enemy.
4 months later, Nate Thayer was invited to interview Pol Pot, who was now under house arrest and close to death.
When I first spoke with Pol Pot, he came up to me and he put his arm on my shoulder and he said, in this raspy voice, he said, Knyum Squalchamo Yuhai, which means I've known your name for a long, long time. And that was the first thing he said to me, and he gave me this gentle, shy smile and kind of looked at me and gazed down and then took me by the arm and walked me to a little bamboo hut where he begged me to understand why it was necessary for him to execute little babies. For hours, in a very rational way. And of course, we started off knowing that it might be very short, asking him the fundamental questions of, you are accused of causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of innocent Cambodians, and are you regretful? Are you sorry? And will you apologize? Which was a direct question repeatedly. And he refused to answer the question. And I did get angry, and he threatened to end the interview 3 times within half an hour because that was not an acceptable answer to me as a journalist or as a human being. Cambodians deserve better, and they deserved, and the world deserves better than 2 journalists interviewing a genocidal maniac in the jungle in a bamboo hut.
2 weeks later, in April 1998, Pol Pot died of natural causes. The madness unleashed on Cambodia by Pol Pot and his colleagues will never be forgotten, but so far it has gone unpunished.